Rose Hartwell was not born into luxury. She was born into a small apartment on the east side of the city, where the walls were thin and the heating only worked half the year. Her mother worked double shifts at a textile factory, and her father was a lesson she learned early, that some people leave, and the only reliable thing in this world is what you build with your own hands. So Rose built. At 22, while her college friends were celebrating graduation with weekend trips and careless spending, Rose was sitting at a second-hand desk in a rented room, drafting her first business proposal with a pen that kept running out of ink. She had no investors, no connections, no safety net. What she had was a mind that moved faster than most, an instinct for identifying what businesses needed before they knew it themselves, and a stubborn, quiet refusal to accept that the world was not made for women like her. Hartwell and Company began as a one-woman consultancy operating out of that rented room. Her first client was a struggling family-owned bakery that needed help restructuring its finances and marketing. She charged them almost nothing, but she worked as though the fate of the world depended on it, because to her it did. Her reputation did. Her future did. The bakery tripled its revenue within 8 months. Word spread the way it does when someone does something genuinely remarkable, quietly at first, then all at once. By 25, Rose had 5 clients and had moved into a proper office space. By 28, Hartwell and Company had a team of 12 and was being approached by mid-sized corporations across the city. By 30, she was sitting across boardroom tables from men twice her age who had underestimated her and left those meetings having agreed to terms she had written herself. She was sharp, she was elegant, and she was, in the most understated way possible, feared. Not because she raised her voice, Rose Hartwell almost never raised her voice, but because she walked into every room having already done the work that others hadn't bothered to do. Because she asked questions that revealed she understood your business better than you did. Because she had a particular stillness about her, the kind that told you, without a single word, that she had already thought 10 steps ahead and was simply waiting for you to catch up. She had built the doors herself. She had never needed anyone to open them for her. And yet, beneath all of it, Rose was still a woman who came home to a quiet apartment and wondered, in the small hours of the night, whether the life she was building had room enough for something softer. Richard Calloway arrived on an unremarkable Thursday evening at a charity dinner Rose had attended more out of professional obligation than genuine interest. He was not the most powerful man in the room. He was not the wealthiest, nor the most decorated, but he had something that the powerful and wealthy men around him seemed to have forgotten. He was genuinely, effortlessly warm. He introduced himself without the usual performance. No rehearsed charm, no careful positioning. He simply looked at her, smiled, and said he had heard a great deal about Hartwell and Company, and that he had always believed the most interesting people in business were the ones who built things from nothing. Rose, who had been complimented countless times in countless ways, found herself unexpectedly disarmed. They talked for 3 hours that evening, not about business, or at least, not only about business. They talked about the city, about the particular loneliness of ambition, about what it meant to want something so badly that you forgot to want anything else. Richard laughed at the right moments. He listened, truly listened, in the way that had become increasingly rare in the world Rose moved through. He was, she thought on the drive home, a breath of fresh air. She did not intend to fall in love with him. She had not left space in her life for it. But love, she would later understand, does not wait for an invitation. It arrives on its own schedule and rearranges everything without asking permission. Over the months that followed, Richard became a constant. Sunday mornings with coffee and no agenda. Long walks through the older parts of the city where neither of them was a CEO or a business person, but simply 2 people who had found something rare in each other. He made her laugh, deeply, unexpectedly, in a way that loosened something she hadn't realized had been wound tight for years. More than anything, he made her feel seen. Not as the founder of Hartwell and Company, not as the woman who had rebuilt a struggling bakery or negotiated 7-figure contracts before her 30th birthday, but as Rose, the woman behind all of it, The one who still sometimes felt the ghost of that thin-walled apartment and needed to be reminded, quietly and without fanfare, that she was allowed to rest. There was one person, however, who was not entirely convinced. Daniel Marsh had known Rose since they were 17 years old, long before Hartwell and Company, long before boardrooms and business proposals and the carefully composed public version of herself she had grown into. He had been there for the early failures, the near collapses, the nights when she had called him in a quiet panic wondering if she had made a terrible mistake choosing this life. He knew her better than anyone, and precisely because he knew her so well, he worried. "He's charming, Rose," Daniel told her one evening over dinner, choosing his words with the care of someone who understood that what he was about to say would not be well received. "But charm is easy. I just want to make sure you know who he is beneath it." Rose had smiled, the patient, slightly exasperated smile she reserved for Daniel when she felt he was being overprotective. "You worry too much," she told him. Daniel had looked at her for a long moment and said nothing more. She remembered that silence later. She would remember it many times. Richard proposed on a quiet evening at home. No grand gesture, no public spectacle. Just the two of them, a simple dinner, and a ring he placed on the table between them with a look that asked everything without a word. Rose said yes before he finished the sentence. The months that followed were the warmest of her adult life. And when Richard, carefully and lovingly, suggested that perhaps Rose had earned the right to step back, that she had spent a decade pouring herself into Hartwell and Company, and that he was more than capable of managing it while she finally allowed herself to simply live, Rose heard it as an act of love. She did not hear the architecture of what was being built around her. She signed the management rights over to Richard on a bright September morning. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself it was trust. She told herself that this was what it looked like to finally let someone in, to hand something precious to someone who had promised, in every way that mattered, to take care of it. She stepped out of the boardroom. She stepped into his world, and for a while, it felt like enough. The quiet mornings, the unhurried evenings, the rare, unfamiliar feeling of not being needed, not being responsible, not being the person on whom everything depended. She almost convinced herself she had made the right choice. Almost, because somewhere beneath the warmth and the stillness, in the part of her that had survived a cold apartment and a father who left and 100 doors that refused to open, Rose Hartwell knew, in the way that the body knows things before the mind is ready to accept them, that something was not quite right. She simply wasn't ready, yet, to look at it directly. That time would come, and when it did, she would be ready. The first year of marriage had been, by every visible measure, beautiful. Rose had settled into a quieter version of herself with more ease than she had expected. She attended dinners on Richard's arm, traveled with him to cities she had previously only visited for conferences, and discovered, with something close to genuine surprise, that she enjoyed the unhurried rhythm of a life not governed entirely by deadlines and deliverables. She read books she had been meaning to read for years. She redecorated the house with the kind of unhurried attention she had never previously allowed herself. She slept well, for perhaps the first time in a decade. Richard, in those early months, was attentive, considerate. He called her from the office in the afternoons for no reason other than to hear her voice. He came home at reasonable hours. He spoke about Hartwell and Company with a respect that reassured her, telling her about client meetings and quarterly projections as though he understood, in some small way, that the company was not merely a business but a living extension of everything she had sacrificed her 20s to build. She had trusted him with something irreplaceable, and he had, for a time, seemed worthy of it. But 3 years into their marriage, something shifted. It began the way these things always begin, so gradually that the mind refuses to register it as a pattern. A late meeting here, a canceled dinner there, a phone placed face down on the table with a casualness that was just slightly too studied. Rose noticed these things the way a person notices a change in weather, a drop in temperature, a shift in the quality of light, and told herself it meant nothing. Richard grew distant in the particular way that busy men grow distant, or so she told herself. The company was expanding. New partnerships required attention. The pressure of managing an operation the size of Hartwell and Company was not something she should dismiss simply because she herself had once carried it without complaint. She extended him the grace she had always extended to the people she loved. She forgave before she even had proof. But the whispers grew louder. It was the company driver, a quiet, careful man named Edwin who had worked for Hartwell and Company since Rose's tenure, who first let something slip. He had not meant to. Rose could see that in the way his eyes dropped the moment the words left his mouth, the way he immediately corrected himself and looked away. He had mentioned, almost in passing, that Mr. Calloway and Miss Lace had taken the car to a hotel in the Northern District on a Tuesday evening when Richard had told Rose he was attending a client dinner across town. The name landed quietly. Miss Lace. Vivian Lace. Rose kept her expression neutral and thanked Edwin with the same composed warmth she always offered him. She waited until she was back inside the house before she allowed herself to sit down and simply breathe. Vivian Lace. Rose had hired her herself 2 years before the marriage, when Hartwell and Company had needed a capable personal assistant for senior management. Vivian had come with impeccable references and a polished, professional manner that Rose had respected immediately. She was efficient, discreet, exactly the kind of person Rose trusted in her world. She had trusted her in her home. She had sat across from Vivian at company gatherings. She had sent her a gift when she heard Vivian had been unwell. She had, on more than one occasion, spoken of her to Richard as an example of exactly the kind of talent Hartwell and Company was fortunate to have. The thought arrived with a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. After that evening, Rose began to notice what she had previously chosen not to see. The lipstick stain on the collar of a shirt Richard had sent to the dry cleaner, a shade Rose had never worn, a soft coral that belonged to someone younger and less careful. She had noticed it before and dismissed it. Now she held the fabric under the light for a long moment before setting it down. The hotel receipt she found 3 days later in the inside pocket of his overcoat, the one she had pulled from the closet to send for cleaning. The date corresponded to a night Richard had told her he was staying over in the financial district due to an early morning meeting. The hotel was not in the financial district. The hotel was 40 minutes from their home, in a quieter part of the city where one went precisely because no one would think to look. The phone calls that ended the moment she entered the room. She had registered this before as habit, as privacy, as the natural inclination of a man who kept his professional and personal life separate. She registered it now as something else entirely. Piece by piece, the picture assembled itself into something Rose could no longer look away from. Her husband was having an affair with Vivian Lace, a woman she had hired, trusted, and welcomed without reservation into the perimeter of her life. The betrayal arrived in layers. The first layer was disbelief, the mind's reflexive refusal to accept what the evidence has already confirmed. She found herself constructing alternative explanations, revisiting details, arguing against her own conclusions with a desperation that felt foreign and humiliating. Rose Hartwell did not do this. She was not a woman who talked herself out of what was plainly in front of her. And yet love, it turned out, had installed a particular kind of blindness that reason alone could not immediately dismantle. The second layer was grief. It arrived on a Wednesday night when Richard was, once again, not home. Rose sat in the living room they had furnished together and looked around at the life they had assembled and felt the full weight of what was dissolving beneath her. Not just the marriage, though the marriage was dissolving. She could see that clearly now. But the version of herself she had become inside it. The woman who had set down her armor and rested. The woman who had, for 3 years, believed that she was finally safe enough to be something other than formidable. She grieved that woman quietly and alone in the dark, with the kind of dignity that no one would ever witness or applaud. The third layer arrived more slowly, and it was colder than the others and sharper and in many ways more useful. Clarity. Rose sat very still and let it settle over her like a second skin. The grief did not disappear. She was not the kind of woman who pretended grief was not real. But it moved to one side, and in the space it left behind, something else emerged. Something with edges. Something precise. She thought about Hartwell and Company. She thought about the management rights she had signed over with a trusting hand and an open heart. She thought about the company she had built from a second-hand desk, and a pen that kept running out of ink. And she began, very carefully, to think. She did not confront Richard that night. She did not confront him the next night, or the one after that. She moved through their shared life with a composure so complete that nothing in her face or her manner betrayed the machinery quietly turning behind her eyes. This, too, was something she had built, the ability to be absolutely still while moving at full speed on the inside. On the fourth night, when Richard had kissed her cheek at the door in that absent, habitual way that had replaced genuine tenderness somewhere in the past year, Rose waited until his car had pulled out of the driveway. Then she picked up her phone. She dialed a number she knew by heart. It rang twice. "Rose!" Daniel's voice was steady, unhurried, the voice of a man who had answered her calls in every season of her life and had never once made her feel that this one was inconvenient. She stood at the window, watching the empty driveway, her posture perfectly straight, her voice perfectly controlled. "Daniel," she said quietly, "I need you to look into something for me." A pause, brief and knowing. Quietly, on the other end of the line, Daniel Marsh said nothing for one long moment. Then, "Tell me everything." And for the first time in 3 years, Rose began to speak with her full voice. She told Daniel everything, not in the breathless, fractured way that grief sometimes forces words out of a person, but methodically, precisely, the way she had once presented quarterly reports to rooms full of skeptical investors. The driver, the receipt, the caller, the name, Vivian Lace. She laid each piece of evidence down in sequence, and when she finished, the line was silent for a long moment. Daniel did not say, "I told you so." He never would. That was not the kind of man he was, and it was not the kind of friendship they had. What he said instead was, "How long do you need?" Rose understood the question. Not how long before she fell apart. Daniel knew better than to ask that. But how long before she was ready to know the full truth, before she was ready to look at the complete picture, however dark it turned out to be. "A week," she said. She gave herself exactly that. The week that followed was perhaps the most demanding performance of Rose Hartwell's life. She moved through it as she had always moved through difficulty, with her spine straight and her expression unreadable. She cooked dinner. She asked Richard about his day. She sat beside him on the sofa on Friday evening and watched a film she did not register a single frame of, while her mind moved quietly and deliberately through everything Daniel had begun to uncover. Because Daniel Marsh, true to his nature, had not wasted a single day of that week. By the third day, he had confirmed what Rose had already known in her body, if not yet in legal terms. The affair was real, ongoing, and had been for longer than she had initially suspected. Vivian Lace had, by all appearances, become something far more than a personal assistant. She accompanied Richard to private dinners. She had been seen at a property in the countryside that was registered under a company name Rose did not recognize. By the 5th day, Daniel had uncovered something else. Something that made him call Rose not in the evening, as had been their pattern, but in the middle of the afternoon, his voice carrying a weight she had rarely heard in it before. "Rose," he said carefully, "there's something you need to know about the company." She had listened. She had not interrupted. When he finished, she thanked him, ended the call, and sat for a long time in the garden with her hands folded in her lap and the afternoon light moving slowly across the lawn. Hartwell and Company, the company she had built from a second-hand desk, and a pen that kept running out of ink. The company she had handed to Richard with a trusting heart and an open hand. The ownership, Daniel had told her, appeared to have been quietly restructured. Legal documents filed, transfers executed, all of it done carefully, over time, in a manner designed not to draw attention. She had one more thing to confirm. She decided she would confirm it herself. Rose chose a Tuesday evening, deliberately, methodically, the way she chose everything that mattered. She cooked the dinner herself, set the table with the same quiet care she always brought to their shared meals, lit the candles, poured the wine. When Richard sat down across from her and looked at the table with the mild, distracted appreciation of a man who had long since stopped truly seeing what was in front of him, Rose looked at him and felt something settle into place inside her chest. She was ready. She waited until the first course was finished, until the conversation had moved through its usual hollow rhythms, the small observations about the week, the weather, the inconsequential details that had come to constitute the surface of their marriage. She waited until Richard had refilled his wine glass and leaned back in his chair with the particular ease of a man who believed himself entirely comfortable and entirely safe. Then she looked at him directly and said, in a voice as steady as the table between them, "I know about Vivian." The room shifted. Richard's expression moved through several things in rapid succession: surprise, calculation, and then, settling beneath both of those, something that Rose recognized with a cold, clarifying shock as relief. As though he had been waiting for this. As though the performance of their marriage had exhausted him too, and this was the moment he had been quietly anticipating. He set down his wine glass. He did not deny it. What Rose had prepared for was anger, his or hers or both. What she had prepared for was denial, justification, the defensive machinery that guilt typically assembles when it is finally confronted. She had steeled herself for tears, for raised voices, for the ugly and necessary business of a marriage coming apart at the seams. What she had not prepared for was the particular cruelty of his calm. Richard leaned back in his chair, unhurried, almost relaxed, and looked at her with an expression that sat somewhere between indifference and mild pity. He told her that what she felt no longer mattered. He said it simply, without decoration, as though he were correcting a minor misunderstanding rather than dismantling the foundation of another person's life. He told her that Vivian understood him, that Vivian moved in his world, breathed his air, spoke his language in a way that Rose, who had retreated from that world at his own suggestion, who had stepped back from the boardroom at his gentle, loving encouragement, no longer could. He told her she had become too comfortable, too domestic, too far removed. Rose sat very still and listened to the man she had loved dismantle her with the measured, almost bored tone of someone settling an account. And then he said the words, "The company isn't yours anymore, Rose." He said it quietly, almost gently, as though he were explaining something that should have been obvious. "It hasn't been for a long time. I had the ownership fully transferred 6 months ago. Hartwell and Company belongs to me now. Legally, entirely and permanently." The candle between them flickered. The room was very quiet. Rose did not move. She sat with the words landing on her one by one, each one deliberate and precise as a blade, and she felt them, fully, in the way she had always felt the things that mattered most. Not with panic, not with rage, but with the deep, resonant recognition of someone who has just been shown the complete picture and understands, with terrible clarity, exactly what it means. He had not married her because he loved her. He had married her because she had something he wanted. And he had been patient. God, he had been patient, and kind, and warm, and exactly what she needed him to be for exactly as long as it took to get it. She thought, in that still and ringing moment, of Daniel's voice on the phone 3 years ago. The careful words, the worry behind the patience. "Charm is easy, Rose. I just want to make sure you know who he is beneath it." She had smiled and told him he worried too much. She sat with that now. She let herself feel the full weight of it, not as shame, but as information, as the final, necessary piece of understanding. Then something happened inside Rose Hartwell that had no sound and no visible shape, but that was, in every meaningful sense, the most significant thing that had occurred in that room all evening. She let go of the version of herself that had trusted him, and she became, fully and irrevocably, the version of herself that would not make that mistake again. She stood up slowly. She smoothed the front of her dress with one hand, a gesture so habitual and composed that it seemed almost surreal in the context of what had just been said. She looked at Richard one final time, with the clear and unhurried gaze of a woman who is seeing something exactly as it is, without the distortion of hope or love or the need for things to be otherwise. What she saw was small, smaller than she had realized. A man who had needed to take something from her because he had never built anything of his own. She almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "Thank you," she said, for finally being honest. She walked out of the dining room. She pulled the door close behind her, not with force, but with the firm and final click of something that would not be reopened. In the hallway, alone, Rose Hartwell stood perfectly still. She allowed herself 60 seconds, not to cry, though the grief was there, deep and real and deserving of its time, but to breathe, to feel the full dimensions of what had just changed, to acknowledge, in the privacy of that quiet corridor, that the life she had lived for 3 years was over, and that what came next would require everything she had. 60 seconds. Then she reached into her pocket and dialed. 1 ring. 2. Rose! Her voice, when it came, was quiet and completely level, the voice of a woman who has moved, in the space of a single evening, from grief to precision. "It's worse than I thought," she said. A pause. Brief. Absolute. "We move now." On the other end of the line, Daniel Marsh exhaled once, not in surprise, but in the way a person exhales when something they have been waiting for has finally, definitively arrived. "I'll make the calls," he said. Rose straightened her posture in the empty hallway. Somewhere behind the closed dining room door, Richard Calloway sat alone at a table set for 2, with candles burning and wine poured in the first faint, distant sensation, though he did not yet understand it as such, of everything beginning to slip. He did not know it yet, but the most dangerous version of Rose Hartwell had just walked back into the world. And this time, she was not building for love. She was building for reckoning. The morning after the dinner, Rose woke before sunrise. She lay still for a moment in the guest room. She had moved there in the night, quietly and without drama, taking only what she needed, and looked at the ceiling in the gray pre-dawn light. The grief was still there. She had not pretended otherwise to herself, and she would not. It sat in her chest like something heavy and real, and she respected it enough not to rush past it. But beneath it, steady and cold and precise as a compass needle, was direction. She rose, dressed, and made herself coffee. She sat at the small desk by the window and opened the notebook she had kept since her earliest days building Hartwell and Company, a habit she had never entirely abandoned, even in the quieter years of her marriage. She uncapped her pen and, in her clean and deliberate handwriting, began to write. Not plans, exactly. Not yet, but the architecture of understanding. Everything she knew about Hartwell and Company, everything she remembered about its clients, its contracts, its vulnerabilities, its strengths. Everything that Richard, in his arrogance, had never thought to learn from the woman he had taken it from. She wrote for 2 hours without stopping. When she was finished, she capped her pen, closed the notebook, and called Daniel. "I'm ready," she said. "Let's begin." What followed was invisible to the world, and that invisibility was entirely intentional. Daniel Marsh had spent the better part of a decade building something quietly alongside his public life, a network of trusted contacts, strategic relationships, and carefully maintained alliances that existed largely beneath the surface of the industry's visible landscape. He was not a man who sought attention. He was a man who sought leverage, and he had accumulated it with the patient, unhurried discipline of someone who understood that the most powerful positions are rarely the most visible ones. He and Rose had spoken, over the years, in the oblique and careful shorthand of people who trust each other completely, conversations that circled possibilities without landing on them directly, strategies discussed in the hypothetical, contingencies acknowledged without ever being named. They had never expected to use any of it. Now they moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had been, without fully realizing it, preparing for exactly this. The instrument of Richard's reckoning was not a lawsuit. It was not a public accusation or a press release or any of the loud, visible mechanisms that a lesser strategist might have reached for in anger. Rose had considered each of those options in the hours after the dinner and set them aside one by one, with the same methodical calm she brought to every professional decision. Noise, she understood, was a distraction. Noise drew attention to the person making it. Noise gave your opponent time to prepare, to reposition, to construct defenses. Silence, deployed with precision, was something else entirely. Voss Meridian was incorporated on a quiet Thursday morning, registered under a parent entity that traced back through 3 carefully structured holding companies to a name that meant nothing to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. It was sleek, it was aggressive, and it entered the consulting market with the particular confidence of a firm that already knew precisely which doors to knock on, because the woman behind it had built those doors herself years ago and remembered every detail of their construction. Within the first 2 weeks, Voss Meridian made contact with 7 of Hartwell and Company's most significant clients. It did not poach them loudly. It did not undercut Richard's pricing in ways that would raise immediate flags or invite scrutiny. Instead, it offered something more devastating than lower prices. It offered understanding. Voss Meridian's representatives arrived at meetings already knowing the client's history, their pain points, their unresolved frustrations with their current consultancy. They asked the right questions. They proposed solutions that felt almost uncannily tailored. Because they were. Rose had spent years inside Hartwell and Company before she stepped back. She had built those client relationships herself, had sat across from the people who now ran those companies and learned, with the full attention she brought to everything, exactly what they needed and where they felt underserved. Richard had inherited all of that without understanding any of it. He had maintained the relationships through inertia and institutional momentum, never realizing that the loyalty belonged not to the company's name but to the intelligence and care that had originally built it. Voss Meridian offered that intelligence again. One by one, the clients came. The investors were a different matter, more delicate, more complex, requiring the kind of careful orchestration that Daniel handled with a precision Rose deeply admired. He did not approach them directly. He did not need to. A word here, a question planted there, a carefully timed introduction to someone whose doubts about Hartwell and Company's leadership were already forming independently. Daniel moved through those conversations like a man setting a table, placing each element with deliberate care, knowing that others would eventually sit down and draw their own conclusions. The conclusions they drew were not wrong. Richard, without Rose's institutional knowledge, and without the genuine talent he had inherited alongside her company, had been running Hartwell and Company on the momentum of its reputation rather than the substance of its work. The cracks had been forming for longer than anyone had publicly acknowledged. Voss Meridian's emergence simply accelerated what was already, inevitably, beginning to happen. Key investors began to quietly reconsider their positions. Strategic partnerships that had seemed secure began to feel less so. The most talented members of Hartwell and Company's staff, the ones whose abilities meant they always had options, began to receive approaches from a new and intriguing firm whose identity remained pleasingly mysterious, but whose offer letters were, by every measure, exceptional. They left. Not all at once. That would have been too obvious, too sudden, the kind of exodus that triggers emergency responses. But in the steady, incremental way that signals to anyone paying attention that something has fundamentally shifted. Richard was not paying attention. Richard was distracted by Vivian, by the comfortable assumption of his own security, by the particular blindness that afflicts people who have acquired something through deception and mistake the acquisition for proof of their own capability. He blamed the market when clients left. He blamed disloyal staff when talent departed. He blamed an aggressive new competitor, this Voss Meridian, whoever they were, with the irritated dismissiveness of a man who could not conceive that the threat might be personal. He never looked in the right direction. He never thought to. Rose, meanwhile, re-emerged. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but with the measured, deliberate visibility of a woman who understood that her public presence was itself a strategic instrument. She had been, by the account of anyone who had noticed her absence, simply living, traveling, she said vaguely when asked, reinventing, exploring. She offered nothing more specific than that, and her composure was so complete, her manner so unhurried, that people accepted the explanation without pressing further. She began appearing at industry events, first the smaller ones, then the larger. Always on Daniel's arm, always composed, always wearing the particular expression of a woman who is exactly where she intended to be. She dressed with an elegance that was new, not in the polished, capable way she had dressed as the founder of Hartwell and Company, but in something quieter and more assured. The kind of elegance that does not announce itself because it has nothing to prove. People noticed. They noticed in the way that people notice when someone they thought they understood has shifted into a register they cannot quite categorize. She was softer in expression than they remembered, warmer, somehow, more at ease in her own skin. But there was something beneath that warmth that they could not name, something with edges, something that made people choose their words more carefully than they might have otherwise and find themselves, without entirely understanding why, wanting to impress her. She spoke less than she once had. She listened more. And when she did speak, it was with the quiet precision of someone who has had the luxury of choosing every word with full deliberation, someone who knows, with absolute certainty, that what they are saying matters. At an industry luncheon 6 weeks after Voss Meridian's quiet launch, a journalist who had covered Rose's early years at Hartwell and Company approached her with the tentative energy of someone attempting to read a situation they couldn't fully parse. "Rose," he said, with the careful warmth of an old acquaintance, "you seem different. If you don't mind my saying." Rose looked at him with those clear, composed eyes and smiled, the kind of smile that answered nothing and suggested everything. "Do I?" she said pleasantly. He opened his mouth to elaborate, then thought better of it. "You seem well," he settled on, finally. "I am," she said, and meant it, in the particular way that a person means something when it is both true and an understatement of considerable proportions. She turned back to her conversation. Across the city, in the offices of Hartwell and Company, a quarterly revenue report was being reviewed by a man who did not yet understand that the numbers in front of him were not a problem to be solved, but the beginning of an ending that had already, quietly and irrevocably, been set in motion. The storm had no thunder, no lightning, no visible disturbance in the sky above Richard Calloway's world. It had only Rose, elegant, unhurried, and moving with the calm of a woman who already knew exactly how the weather would turn. The collapse of Hartwell and Company did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It happened the way all genuine collapses happen, in accumulation. In the quiet, compounding arithmetic of loss that builds beneath the surface until the surface can no longer hold. First it was the clients. Not a sudden mass departure, but a steady, inexorable withdrawal. Contracts allowed to expire without renewal, retainer agreements quietly terminated, meetings that were scheduled and then, without explanation, were not. Richard's team brought him the numbers week after week, and week after week he found reasons to dismiss what they were telling him. A market correction, a seasonal slowdown, the aggressive tactics of a new competitor that would, he was certain, burn itself out before long. He did not understand that the competitor was not burning. It was building. Then the investors. The first withdrawal came with a letter of such careful, corporate politeness that Richard almost missed the weight of it. A major institutional investor citing a routine portfolio rebalancing, expressing gratitude for the partnership, wishing Hartwell and Company continued success. By the time the third letter arrived, the language had grown less warm and the stated reasons less vague. By the fifth, Richard's legal team was making calls that were not being returned. Then came the investigation. An anonymous tip, filed with precise timing and accompanied by documentation so thorough and so specifically damaging that the regulatory body that received it had little choice but to act, triggered a formal inquiry into Hartwell and Company as financial practices. The specific irregularities cited were real. Richard had not manufactured them. He had simply been careless, as men who inherit power without earning it often are, assuming that the institutional weight of what he had taken would protect him from scrutiny indefinitely. It had not. The company's accounts were frozen on a Wednesday morning in early spring. Richard arrived at the office to find his senior financial officer waiting in the corridor with an expression that required no explanation. By the end of that week, the story was in the financial press. By the end of the following week, it was everywhere. Vivian Lace, who had positioned herself as the woman behind the man and had accepted without question Richard's assurances that what they had built together was solid and permanent and entirely hers to enjoy, left on a Thursday afternoon. She did not make a scene. She did not offer an explanation or a farewell. She simply gathered what was hers and a few things that were not, and disappeared back into the world with the efficiency of someone who had always maintained, in some private and practical corner of themselves, an exit strategy. Richard came home that evening to a house that felt different in a way he could not immediately name. It took him several minutes of standing in the hallway to understand what he was feeling. He was alone. Genuinely, completely alone, in a way that had nothing to do with the physical absence of another person and everything to do with the full, arriving recognition that every person who had been in his life recently had been there because of what he had, not because of who he was. The money was gone. The company was gone. The reputation was in free fall. And with those things gone, so was everyone who had come with them. He sat down on the floor of the hallway, the same hallway where, 3 years ago, Rose had stood for 60 seconds in perfect stillness before making a phone call that would dismantle everything he thought he had secured, and he sat there for a long time. He thought about Rose. He thought about the way she had looked at him across the dinner table on that Tuesday evening. The stillness of her, the composure that he had read, in his arrogance, as shock, as the paralysis of a woman who had been outmaneuvered and didn't yet know what to do about it. He understood now, sitting on the floor of a house he could no longer afford, that what he had seen on her face that evening had not been shock at all. It had been the expression of a woman who had already decided what came next. The industry gala was held on the first Friday of April, the most prestigious event in the city's business calendar, the kind of evening that functioned simultaneously as celebration, networking, and the public performance of power. Attendance was a statement. Absence was noted. Richard went because not going would have been an admission he was not yet ready to make. He arrived in a suit that was slightly less perfect than it once would have been, with the careful composure of a man holding himself together through the force of practiced habit. The room was everything it always was, luminous, loud with the particular music of important people performing their importance, thick with the scent of money and ambition and expensive things. He saw her the moment she entered. Rose. She did not make an entrance in the theatrical sense. She did not pause in the doorway or wait for the room to turn. She simply walked in, with Daniel at her side and a group of the city's most significant figures already gravitating toward her as though by some natural law of attraction, and the room reorganized itself around her presence without her asking it to. She was wearing deep emerald. Her posture was the kind that does not announce itself, but fills whatever space it occupies completely. She was laughing at something Daniel had said, genuinely, warmly, with the unconstructed ease of a woman who is exactly where she belongs and knows it without requiring anyone else to confirm it. Richard stood very still and looked at her. She was different. More than different. She was more. More herself. More present. More luminous than she had been at any point in the 3 years of their marriage. She wore her elegance now not as a professional armor, but as a natural condition, the way a person wears their own skin when they have finally stopped apologizing for it. He had expected, in whatever private and unexamined part of himself had thought about this moment, to feel superior, to feel the satisfaction of a man who had made his choices and lived with them. Instead, standing in the glittering room watching the woman he had underestimated orbit at its center, Richard Calloway felt something he had not anticipated. He felt small. He crossed the room because standing still felt worse. He told himself he simply wanted to understand, to ask the questions that had been accumulating in him since the investigation began, since the clients left, since the investors withdrew, since the whole careful architecture of what he thought he had built began to reveal itself as something far less solid than he had believed. Rose saw him coming. He could tell by the infinitesimal shift in her expression, not alarm, not anticipation, but the calm and unhurried adjustment of a woman who has noted the approach of something entirely manageable. She said his name when he reached her. Just his name, Richard, with a pleasant, mildly interested tone one uses for a distant acquaintance encountered at a party. Nothing in it was unkind. Nothing in it was warm. It was the tone of complete and total indifference. And it was, Richard understood in that moment, the most devastating thing she could possibly have offered him. He stumbled through what he wanted to say, asked how she was doing this, asked who was behind Voss Meridian, the firm that had, piece by piece, disassembled everything he thought he owned. His voice, stripped of the confidence that money and position had previously provided, came out smaller than he intended. He asked, finally, the question he had really come to ask, whether it had been her, whether all of it, from the beginning, had been Rose. She smiled. It was not a triumphant smile. It was not cruel, not cold, not the smile of a woman savoring a victory she had been waiting to display. It was something quieter than any of those things, the smile of a woman who knows something that requires no announcement, because the truth of it is already entirely evident to everyone present. She did not answer him. She did not need to. She turned back to her guests. Naturally, unhurriedly, as though the interruption had been minor and was now complete, and Richard stood for one long, exposed moment in the middle of the room before understanding, with a clarity that arrived too late to be of any use to him, that there was nothing left for him here. He left before the dinner was served. Later in the evening, when the gala had reached the warm and luminous hour when conversations deepen and the performance of the earlier part of the night gives way to something more genuine, Daniel leaned close to Rose and asked her quietly if she felt better. Rose considered the question with the full attention she brought to things that deserved it. The grief, she knew, was still there, would be there for a long time yet, because loss does not resolve itself on a schedule, and she had never been a woman who pretended otherwise. The marriage had been real, even if the man had not been. The years she had given had been real. The version of herself she had set aside in that hallway on a Tuesday evening, that, too, had been real and had cost something genuine to leave behind. But beneath the grief, and around it, and running through it like light through water, she felt something else. Something she had not felt in 3 years. Something she had not realized, until its return, that she had been missing. Herself. "I don't feel revenge," she said. Her voice was quiet and entirely certain. "I feel like myself again." She paused. "That's better than revenge." Daniel looked at her for a moment, the look of a man who has known someone long enough to understand when they are telling the complete truth, and nodded, once, with the simple warmth of a person who is genuinely glad. Rose raised her glass. The room shimmered around her, the light catching crystal and laughter, and the particular brilliance of a space filled with people who had gathered, as they did every year, to be in the presence of something significant. This year, they had gathered, without knowing it, in the presence of Rose Hartwell. Not Rose Calloway, not the woman who had stepped back from boardrooms for love and paid a price that no one would have thought to ask of her. Not the woman who had stood in a hallway and allowed herself 60 seconds of grief before deciding what came next. Rose Hartwell, the woman who had built doors when none were given to her. The woman who had started with a second-hand desk and a pen that kept running out of ink and had built, from those modest and determined beginnings, something that no one, not even a man who had taken it from her with a legal document and a cold smile, could permanently take away. Because what Richard had taken was a company. What he had never understood was that the company was never the thing. Rose was the thing. Rose had always been the thing. And Rose, elegant and unhurried and entirely, undeniably herself, was still here, still building, still the most powerful person in any room she chose to enter. She lowered her glass. She looked around at the room, at the people, the light, the shimmer of an evening that belonged, in every way that mattered to her, and she felt deep and quiet and real, something that she would not have been able to name 3 years ago but could name now without difficulty. She felt free. End of Chapter 5. Epilogue. Hartwell and Company was formally dissolved 4 months later. Voss Meridian, under its newly public leadership, Rose Hartwell, founder and chief executive, was named the city's most significant emerging consultancy of the year. Daniel Marsh was appointed its managing director. Richard Calloway left the city quietly. No one wrote about it, and Rose Hartwell, who had been born into a thin-walled apartment on the East Side and had built everything she owned with her own hands and her own mind and her own stubborn, elegant refusal to accept that the world was not made for women like her, returned to her desk. A new notebook, a good pen, and all the time in the world,